Well, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. For those of you who don't know me, obviously some of the faces are known and familiar to me, and we had a lot of good discussions before getting into this final session, and I do have a time constraint, and I promised my good colleague Francois to be on time, so I'm going to try to keep an eye on that little clock up there. For those of you who don't know me, I'm professor of strategy management, but I was trained as a city planner and engineer, and then I also an economist, and I'm at Reims Management School currently, but also I'm affiliated with and working with Francois in the research laboratory that he's running, obviously here at Habité, and of course we do work on some projects, in particular projects dealing with sustainability. I'm also in charge of Sustainable Development Program at Reims Management School, which is a business school, it's a management school, and of course a few other areas of social innovation. So the topic here, dynamics. Now, by the way, I have to apologize. I wrote these things in June of this year because we had the discussion, and I haven't really decided, or maybe I should have, but I didn't get a chance to put all these slides back into English. I'm going to be speaking to you in English, but obviously you do have a lot of these in French. And I thought, after all, it's not a bad idea to have both French and English. So you do get the text in French. I do speak on top of it in English. So this is the topic, how dynamic governance, obviously, of metropolitan areas, cities have to deal with the problematic of sustainability. Well, that's a little bit, I don't know what the problem is, but it seems to be short. Just a few concepts, what I call key concepts, and then we get into basically looking at the major stakes, and in particular, I look at the actors as well as mode of governance, and some of the objectives and outcomes of sustainability. I put outcome in English because that was one of those tricky words. What is an outcome? And we're going to see that. What is the process of sustainability leads to an outcome, a situation that I consider to be maybe more significantly presented in English, outcome. Forces and contingencies, and a few axes of research, because this program is part of a larger research project that I'm doing, and of course, I will tell you a little bit of this. It's more of a conceptual framework. We don't get into metrics, but I can say you a few things about the metrics at the end. Just very briefly about the space, because time is obviously limited. And the issue of cities is a dilemma, because historically big cities have always been what we, as I put them, have been very much growth-centered. In other words, the idea of city growing is based on the idea that city can grow economically. So here we have a dilemma. Development versus, obviously, growth, which there's nothing wrong with that, but then when it comes into sustainability criteria, we do get into problems. So, obviously, there are some definitions, how cities are composed, how we have these central places, how international, what we call metropolitan space, obviously can deal with issues such as housing, such as office space, such as airports. Well, I was trained as a city planner at the Ponts, I called the Ponts et Chaussées engineer, so I still have a little bit of those remnants. The way I get into thinking about a city is very much in terms of functionalities of the city. Obviously, we have what we call a morphological agglomeration that goes around the city. But the problem we have, as you brought up, pretty much is the problem of the delimitation and the problem of resources moving from one to the other side. So these obviously are some of the problems we have to deal with when we talk about sustainability. The problem of dimensions of territories, well, I'm just obviously very much being inspired by my good colleague Francois, who has also written extensively on these issues. We have an identity problem, we have a material or physical problem, we have an institutional, organizational problem of space, we have what we call an economic problem. But to tell you the truth, I've been working very much on the very last point, which is informational. In other words, a space which we call metropolitan space is increasingly informational and knowledge-driven. And that's a discussion we had, Mr. Sachs and also Chori mentioned that this is about learning how to diffuse information and get into what we call knowledge base. So these are some of the dimensions of what we call metropolitan space. And of course, there's a dimension that, by the way, this is just the introductory part before I get into the second part, which I call the stakes, the dimension that I call economics. That's the dilemma of big cities, because they're constantly concerned about how this should be incorporated into this space. So it's been historically the major preoccupation of researchers. And of course, I don't want to get into history because that's what I worked. My thesis was very much on these issues, how big cities basically grew bigger. And there is a history behind this, how von Thunen in 1854 all the way through more recent work have obviously developed these theories and conceptualized them and put them into what we call some practice. Now, of course, we can come back if you have any questions. More recently, because of time constraint, I'm going to try. Most recently, Krugman, who got the Nobel Prize back a few years ago, was probably the one who really very much put into what I call perspective the notion of space and economic theory and how neoclassical economists needed to update or bring maybe to a higher level the reflection on the place. In other words, space is not neutral. It does have an impact on the relationship that is generated through economic activities. Well, again, I put these things in French, and I hope as I'm scanning through quickly, you can get an idea. But of course, you're more than welcome to get a copy of this if needed. So there's a big dilemma, and that's the dilemma of cities when they come to the conclusion that, okay, we need to develop, but we also need to grow. So what is this basically dichotomy between development and growth? And of course, there have been historically different empirical conceptual models that have been built into this. And of course, there is obviously a notion of topology, morphology, different zones that obviously define how cities should move around, what we call spatial organizations. It's also an issue about the hypotheses we make. Now, the second point is a very important point when it comes to sustainability, because if you really look at the second one carefully, it's about all the hypotheses, issues, assumptions we make about behavior of the agents and what I call the parties prenantes, the stakeholders here, all those who basically have the power publicly, privately to decide, to bring to the fore, obviously. And of course, for example, look at the role of the state at local or regional or national level when it comes into collecting taxes or distributing public goods, or eventually some other aspects of what we call public utility functions and aspects. That second point is important when it comes to sustainability topic. The third one is also important to the extent that it really deals with the issues of how within these metropolitan space, three categories play a major, more critical role. Basically, what is about housing, how we house people, because after all, a city without housing, people who live, I was just looking at the latest data, big cities attract talents, big cities attract investments. There is a big, obviously, debate about how to make sure that these flows continue. So it's really about housing, transportation, and obviously what we call other goods that basically use on a daily basis. And there's a third dimension when it comes into space, and it's about modeling or conceptualizing, which is beyond the scope. Pretty much historically, it's been no classical model. We have decided when we develop some of these theories about sustainability, this does not hold, and it works. So this point is over. I'd like to emphasize a few points here. The main stakes here is about the role that these actors and stakeholders play and how they, obviously, the mode of a governance operate. So this is the idea. The question is, this is if you want the research question, or the question that we have to think or reflect, ponder on, is what are the principal stakes, main stakes that cities in metropolitan space have to face? And that's the really dilemma of sustainability. Do they have to accelerate growth? Basically because there are employments and wealth issues associated. Do they have to make sure that there is a development that is obviously equitable and sustainable? Do they have to make sure that there is biodiversity? These issues are being up more and more. That is being preserved. Do they have to eventually think in terms of equity? We had the discussion on the margin of this conference yesterday with a lot of good colleagues here that after all, can we really think about sustainability outside the notion of social justice and democracy, and eventually, is that system sustainable if we don't have in place already a way to tackle those within a democratic framework? But I'd like to focus mostly on the capacities, and I think, Christopher, you had brought this up, how these capacities are built, human, social, and eventually what kind of stakes Francois had already been mentioning in the few different discussions we had that this is really a big issue of intergenerational and ecosystemic balance, which is always an issue. In other words, we don't have one type of sustainability, but maybe different models of sustainability. Just to give you some ideas. Now, that's one of those slides that I had, and I did not translate everything, but just give you some ideas. Close to 600 urban, this is recently it's come out, 600 urban centers generate today about 60% of global GDP. While 600 cities will continue to account for the same share of global GDP in 2025, 10 years from now, 12 years from now, over the next 15 years, in other words, by 2040, we will then be basically witnessing that the gravity of the urban world will move towards south and east. And when we talk about south and east, there's nothing wrong with that. But south and east do not have the institutions that can support sustainability to the extent that we have them as we're building up. Of course, you talked about Brazil, how they're working on it. We've been talking about the issues. So as we move economic power to south and eastern zones of the world, we will be facing a sustainability issue in terms of governance because of the institutions that are missing. Another issue point that needs to be mentioned, half of global GDP in 2007, 5 years ago, came from only 380 cities in the world. And of course, we call them developed cities, developed city regions. Some of these are city states, such as Singapore, of course, which by itself is a state, but this is the idea. And more than 20% of the global GDP is coming from 190 North American cities alone today. In other words, we have GDP of the world, 20% of it coming from the US, North American. Of course, 2 big cities from Canada are also included. The 220 largest cities in developing regions only contributed by 10% of the world GDP. So if you really look at this and the question of how this happens by 2025, 1/3 of these developed market cities will no longer make, 1/3 of the cities that we're talking about, 300, those 120 will no longer be in the top 600. And of course, 1 out of every 20 cities will be obviously in emerging markets, emerging economies. I don't call them emerging, I have the tendency to call them re-emerging, because these countries happen to be very major countries in the past. Now, the word emerging, I don't like it. I call it, re-emerging. And obviously, this is another issue to take into account. By 2025, again, about 12 years from now, 130 new cities are expected to enter the top 600. In other words, we will have cities whose names are not currently on the list within the next 12 years. Emerging, moving to the top as the big cities, and some of these 100 new cities will be coming from what we call the BRIC zone, the Brazil, Russia, and so on and so forth, India, of course. Okay, now coming back again to a few French slides. I don't want to get into details, but I just want you to make sure that this last paragraph, how the impact of human activities has an impact on some issues that are not necessarily economically measurable easily, but they at some point need to be taken into account. For example, issues of health. You talked about, I believe, 17% of the US GDP being in the health sector, which is absolutely true. I thought it was just a little bit even more than that, but I guess your figures are right. Then the renewing of resources is an issue. We had a discussion yesterday, what is a resource? The notion of, obviously, how to deal with the waste, that's a big part of our world, basically, is city planning, and how we can obviously distribute wealth and well-being, and obviously, when it comes to that point, the issue is about the choices that individuals have to make, but also collectively, individually and collectively. Just some of the stakes, major, I put them here. These are big stakes that all metropolitan spaces are obviously exposed to. Access to resources. Of course, these resources are natural, human, financial, or technological. Obviously, to have the right peri-urban, and we talked about what is the right balance between an urban and peri-urban zone, and how do we really preserve this? Now, some cities like Reims, for example, because of the importance of a particular economic activity, which is Champagne activity, do benefit from what we call an economic barrier for the time being, or maybe in some other cases it could be the role of the lawmaker to make it be possible. But of course, when you think in terms of benefits that you can get from what we call in France le foncier by selling, then obviously you somehow the demarcation line between peri-urban and urban gets a little bit blurred here. The idea of mobility of migrations, we had the discussions that we don't really think enough about migrants. And what is the impact of migrants on sustainability? We always take it for granted that migrants are naturally integrated in the system into which they enter. The reality is that there is a lot of work here to see that migrants do carry with them from one city to another, from one country to another, from one region to another, problems of sustainability. And of course, it's about education, it's about employment, it's about training, and so on and so forth. So we do have demographic equality of obviously skill. Employees, investment, technological infrastructure, quality of environment, and obviously there are other issues such as social and economic, institutional, regulatory, and so on and so forth. 3 levels of actors need to be identified at every moment, and I call them micro and macro and meso and macro level. And of course, this model that I'm giving is more conceptual, but when it comes into meso and macro, I'm doing a little bit of research, and hopefully this will be further discussed if you're interested. Just a few things. We talked about the knowledge and know-how, how this sharing of knowledge and some of those practices, knowledge practices, make the innovation obviously dynamics, provide with opportunities for solving or tackling some of those issues which we call sustainability. But in itself, it's not enough, because technology is not necessarily a solution. It may, in some cases, even add a layer of problem. I can give you some examples if needed. I need to make sure that this is wrapped up in 10 minutes. You might have some questions. But for example, the way we build clusters around some of the big cities, we call them scientific clusters or technological clusters, but they do create sustainability issues. And we can talk about some of these clusters that are around in the US, and also in France, in Europe, or in Japan, which I know a little bit about, in particular the way the public authorities have tried to manage and plan the formation of the clusters. Some of the variables and indicators need to be discussed. After all, if we have to measure sustainability, wealth versus development, croissance, as we said, versus obviously development, how do we go about it? There are some socio-spatial variables, which I call them basically related to network of activities, production, and so on and so forth. There are some demographic and economic issues that need to be taken into account. That's the metric system we don't get into now, but obviously at some point it needs to be addressed. How the obviously infrastructure is put in place. Some of the ecosystemic, which is obviously the main focus of this conference, ecosystemic issues such as index of biodiversity, or maybe, of course, these were discussed. I think there is now a consensus that needs to be taken into account when we look at the dynamics of metropolitan or big cities, because after all, you can't grow without the implications for some of those important sustainability concerns. But I'd like to focus the last few minutes on, maybe 5 minutes, on the contingencies. We do have now that we realize that these forces are in place, we do have also contingencies to which cities and big spaces are subjected. These forces are centrifugal or centripetal forces, but anyways, they basically sometimes act in directions that are opposing to each other. I call them major contingencies: economics, obviously contingency, social contingencies. We can put into these, obviously, a framework of measurement, ecosystemic, and of course the last one, which is technological. In other words, if you really had to look at this model, you see that the governance of development of a space or territories metropolitan is really at the same time needs to be put into a network of contingencies. Environmental contingencies take you to the issue of resources, how they're used and how they're made. After all, what is a resource, how it's mentioned? And also at the same time takes you to sustainability, and I know that you do have, François, this fort or weak or levels of sustainability needs to be addressed. how we can obviously improve the social networks, and obviously when it comes to social issues, that is also connecting us to technological, because this cannot be done without quality of work, without quality of networks, and how people get connected to each other. So really this creates a dynamic sort of cycle that could be, to some extent, eventually used as a virtuous cycle. It's not necessarily a vicious circle, but you got to be careful about the implications here. So this is what Francois had mentioned. I brought it up here, how we get into these dilemmas in terms of those interests. Interest of generations and their future, today's and future, interest of human versus ecosystem, and of course, interest of developed versus less developed nations. You really can put it again into a perspective where these interests would eventually, in the heart of the system, create what we call demand for social choices. And of course, social choices, yes, these are collective social choices, and of course, they lead to developing thinking in terms of processes and decision making. Well, there is an issue of resource. I don't want to get into it unless you have a question. There is a big debate on how resources should be called, developed. I think the best work, probably one of the best works, is the Ostrom's book on resources, common pool resource, and of course how the resource system operate, how the unit resources need to be discussed. There was obviously what we call the dilemma of the commons. Obviously it's being discussed very much here. Public versus private resources, and big metropolitan areas have to deal with both of these dilemmas. In other words, public versus private. And of course, the best use that we can make is about making sure that we have systems of regulations and, of course, control that are at, as I told you, micro level, meso level, state, and of course, it can go all the way down to the individual, and individual being the person who eventually decides to get involved economically. I can call that individual an entrepreneur. It's a very entrepreneurial level. And no matter what you do, you're an entrepreneur. Even if you want to write a book, you're basically you get into an entrepreneurial decision. So that's the idea, entrepreneurial enterprise. It can eventually move on to the agency or maybe level of states. And of course, states have different layers, as has already been discussed. So there's a lot of work that could be very interesting in terms of building that dynamic links from Olson and Schelling, all this sort of things, Hardin and Williamson in terms of institutions. Of course, we don't get into this here. And of course, we don't want to talk about Rio because of lack of time, but I believe those points that are being mentioned within the principles that we call 5th, 6th, 7th, and all the way from 18th to 15th are principles in which most city planners think and tend to agree, or at least implement in their planning process. I still happen to have a few friends who are in the city planning here and outside. When I finished my studies in the mid-90s, I had to go to a country which is developing today. It didn't work out, but we talked about countries that were not really developed, like Iran in those years. Of course, things didn't work out for me to stay longer, but they were very, very conscious about the problems that a big mega city in the Middle East, Tehran, could be facing in terms of diversity, biodiversity, in terms of, sustainability, already in the late 90s, almost 15 years ago. So if you really look at this issue, I just came up with these contingencies, issues related to environment, issues related to economics and social. You can't really create a sort of matrix where you can look at your ecosystemic choices and eventually strategies that need to be implemented, production in terms of economics, and eventually what needs to be done in terms of models of production. Do we make them intensive? Do we make them extensive? Eventually issues related to social. And of course here we have a broad array of issues to deal with. For example, when it comes to social equity, this is the first principle of Rio, but I'm not sure to what extent it's being really thought or implemented. I'm coming to an end in about 2 minutes to basically give you this sort of final thing. So if you look at the sort of macro picture, you do have 4 levels that I really consider to be the level of actors where the entrepreneur, enterprise, institutions, but it can be state, play a role. This does have an impact on the way processes are thought, cooperation or non-cooperation, mode of operation, because actors don't always cooperate with each other. Sometimes they fight, and sometimes get into conflictual problems that we need to consider. And of course, this is done within what we call contexts. Now, we are operating today in market economy context. Nobody can really negate that. But at the same time, while we're operating in a market-driven context, we basically tend to. This morning, my good friend was telling me, what is the market? 10 or 15 people are the market. Quite frankly, it's more than 10 or 15 people. That's the problem. The market is the guy who invests, but it's also the guy who gets the job. The guy who gets the job is the guy who buys the goods. The guy who buys the goods is the guy who obviously sustains activity elsewhere. So it's really about considering the role of the market. Of course, we can't get out of it for the time being. And of course, the issue then becomes the issue of outcome, how these outcomes need to be analyzed at different levels, micro, meso, macro, which I can, at least as an example, last minute, give you just. Now, this takes us to one last point. Sustainability, and we had this discussion, cannot be thought outside the notion of social innovation. You can't have a model for sustainability if you can't think in terms of dynamics of it. So somehow this deals with the multifaceted social process that eventually creates boundaries or gets rid of boundaries. We think in a different way. Field of social, obviously, innovation cuts across a wider area of disciplines, and we need to think along those lines. So this is something that is need to be taken. So sustainability is pretty much the initiatives that challenge the established business and market rules. After all, we do hear a lot about sustainable development as being a challenge to established business, or some businesses considered as not necessarily operatable in their area, although there is now a demand for corporate social responsibility and sharing value by other stakeholders. So social choices, the last point, which is very important, I'd like the last 2 points, are institutionally embedded. In other words, when we make choices, we don't make the choices haphazardly. Choices are made within institutional settings, which pretty much means that a French man makes a different set of choices than a Dominican man or American man. And we shouldn't be surprised if the choice sets are different. And of course, the last point is the example that was provided by Professor Bachuri about how difficult it was to implement these choices within a global setting, which was on climate change. One point just to finish on the investigation, field of investigation, that's one of the models I'm using, and in fact we're just putting a little metric system together, how we look at the social dimensions of individual and organizational systems and how this leads step by step to defining levels and impacts, formalize the rules, come into social outcome. Then obviously here we have to look at some of those institutional impact and transition to a new idea. And of course at some point, as you said, the initiative is at the very bottom level, at the very micro level, at the level that it's the smallest possible. That's what you seem to also mention, Christopher. I'm done, just give you an idea. Currently there's a metric system that we're working on. I'm working mostly on it, and it basically takes different models, and we compare different models with some control variables and some of those factors that I consider to be set of factors, not one factor. Environmental, social, economic discussions we had. And then we try to compare the models. So it basically gives us a way to see which kind of initiatives or business activities within metropolitan areas have what kind of impacts in terms of wealth creation, developing, or eventually some of those sustainable activities, and so on and so forth. I have one example that I can provide you if you're interested about comparing the city of Atlanta, where I spend a little bit of time, and we're working with the Economic Development Office, and obviously this is an interesting case study for me myself as we're going through some of the choices they're making, in particular when it comes into peri-urban versus urban, basically the relationship. Okay, so essentially just to finalize, it is obviously difficult to come up with a model that which can give you the best metric system. But no matter which model you use, you definitely need to take into account the contingencies and account for, obviously, ranges, probabilities that could eventually may not fall in the system. And of course, some of these models are being discussed, but I'm not sure about which of those models currently are being accepted or approved by proponents or defenders of sustainability studies. I don't know of any of those models currently. We talk about the debate, but there's no metric behind it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I try to be
just one question. I have three questions. Four questions. Okay. Very well. 4 questions on a row, and then you try to answer
response.
Very, very, very short.
I try to be short. Yes.
Didn't you forget 2 key factors for me? The political one and the tax system that are linked together and that have lots of consequences either locally and nationally and internationally.
Okay, I remember it's political and levels. Okay.
I need some help to the micro.
Oh, Sharon, thank you for this presentation. I found it very systemic, so very interesting in that point of view.
Conceptual.
But how far does this approach apply specifically to metropolitan spaces? So many of the principles you have put forward are really principles useful for sustainability, sustainable development as a whole, also in the inter-metropolitan spaces. I had others, but I leave that to others.
Qui est l'autre? Si quelqu'un veut bien s'occuper du micro, comme ça je... Non mais il y a aussi quelqu'un aussi en économie, je ne me rappelle plus du nom.
It's going to be the next topic, but seeing that you're at the business school, do you really believe in CSR, corporate social responsibility? I mean, you said there's a role, but...
Okay, I basically have 2 comments. Maybe to join the first one, it's about land tenure and a missing point as well related to population pressure and the density of it. When we're thinking about Dhaka or India in general, like Bangladesh, when we think about population pressure, and that you can see that in your PowerPoint. And the second thing as well is I'm quite surprised that when we think about city, megacity and all, we're not talking yet about peri-urban area, because most of the ghetto, let's say, or slum area, where we have all of the problem of poverty, land tenure, are related not as such as of the city or the old city, but mainly about the peri-urban area. And I would like to know if there is any kind of book or article that you have in that.
Okay, is that it? Very briefly on the political side, yeah, I know you have a question, I'll take it. The political side, maybe I was a little bit fast on it. I did mention something about institutionals, and I said that political decisions are somehow built within, but of course you're right, it's a good point that you bring up, because political dynamics at some point may eventually reverse some of those institutional things, yeah. I didn't put it because somehow for me, but you're right, after all you can think in terms of political forces that could eventually consider. Somehow it was implied in my mindset when I talk about social institutional changes, but it may need to be re-emphasized or and it's the same point that you brought up, Bettina. I do mention about the weight of population, demographic weight from the very beginning. I just went on very quickly through some of the slides. I did mention, and I said that this is the cause of problems in terms of urban, peri-urban balance. I maybe didn't take as much time to emphasize. Marcel, just about what you said, the model, yes, it's a sort of very much systemic, as you said, conceptual, but we can take out of this portion and eventually try to see what specific sustainability criteria can be used for specific zones within the city. For example, a big city doesn't have the same type of problems, big city being, again, size or domain of activity of this. But again, you're right. It's very much conceptual sort of, I would say, approach, at least at this stage, the way it was presented today. I think there was one point I tried to be fast, so CSR. I tell you something, CSR was something that was imposed by regulatory, basically, instances and institutional pressures. But as they were implemented, as a manager, as a professor of management, as they were implemented in the organizations, they learn, businesses are smart, learn how to cope with it. And in fact, beyond CSR, there are now companies that are talking about sharing value. If you look at the latest article by Porter, he has an article about sharing value. So he really goes beyond even the CSR. But I agree with you. CSR, it's something that has been imposed. To what extent it's being respected or implemented is a big issue. And the belief is that as long as there is no mean to push it or reinforce it, it may not be as much. But it's a big debate in corporations nowadays, that socially responsible, do good and do well. It is a topic that is very much not being discussed, that you can do good and you can do well at the same time. I think you had a question, you know, very quickly. I try to be short.
Short.
Yeah.
Okay. Vous avez insisté, tu as insisté sur renforcement des capacités et l'innovation sociale, qui sont deux thèmes fortement émergents depuis quelques années. Néanmoins, c'est un peu contre-intuitif dans le cas des villes dans lesquelles il faut des politiques de planification fortes et des volontés politiques si on veut imposer la reconnaissance d'espaces multifonctionnels dans des dynamiques économiques qui ont tendance à pousser, à cause du foncier, à l'hyperspécialisation. Donc je ne vois pas très bien comment cette problématique des capacités ou cette problématique de l'innovation peuvent réellement être des outils pour résoudre les problèmes urbains.
Maybe not tools, but definitely processes that are in, you know, creating pressure. I don't know. I'm like you. I have the same. But I didn't really spend much time on social innovation side. I think it's in itself a big chapter, the most important chapter. But I think it's not a tool. You don't look at it as a tool. Look at it as a process. It's not an outil. It's a process. So it's really built processes. So it really builds into the system as pressure builds up. And you have to address some specific issues. For example, issue of housing of young people or housing of elderly people. This is not an issue if you don't have an old population, but it becomes an issue when you have to deal with it. Young youth is the same thing. It's not an issue when you don't have young people. When you have a university with a lot of young people around the city, then it becomes an issue. So issues are like resources. They don't necessarily exist at a point in time. They basically build up through a dynamic process. But I don't know if you agree with that answer. But I think it's not it is something that is in the making as you get into a bigger and bigger metropolitan space. Big cities have a type of problems that the small cities don't have, and vice versa sometimes for different reasons. But again, it becomes obviously a matter of socially innovating and critically thinking about those processes. Sorry for having been too long, but hopefully I answer your questions. Thank you.